the next step after divesting or deciding that you want to stop climate change or slow climate change, what happens next, which is adaptation?
Right, I'm afraid it's not next, it's parallel, but we can have
parallel,
a conversation.
Yeah. Well, okay, so it's parallel. Tell me about that.
Right, so we just heard there's a lot of track record, and we're getting to a point where investing in renewables is not necessarily impact, it's just a good investment, period. The conversation that isn't quite happening yet, but really need to start as a topic is how do we invest in measures that will help us prepare for the impacts of climate change? So really thinking about flood prevention, wildfire prevention, working in preparation for more drought, for more hurricanes. There's a wide variety of things that cities and corporations need to be doing that they're not quite doing enough of right now. And the World Resources Institute actually published some really interesting numbers a few years ago showing the gap between what is estimated to be the needs for adaptation investment globally and what is currently being invested. And it's a gap of about $120 billion annually out of $140 billion. In other words, there's just a tiny amount of money. It's only public money right now. And for folks who live and breathe adaptation, the question is always, how do we get private capital to come to the adaptation space?
I mean, it's difficult enough to say to people, I want you to be patient capital. I want you to believe that these poor people, when they get light, will start to be able to pay for it at some point in the future, and that's going to transform lives and you will see that return. To then say to people, you know what, you're going to have to build your cities on stilts and you're going to have to think about your flood defenses. I mean, people don't even insure everything they should in their own personal lives.
Right, and there's a lot of different ways that those investments can take shape, and some of it will be government-driven and is public good focused, and we will need to leverage all the good thinking and lessons learned from impact investing over the past decades around what's a social impact bound, how do you create revenues out of things that are not revenue generating per se.
Can you give me a couple of crunchy examples, like really concrete examples of things you think you can say to people you've learned from looking at impact investing?
So I'll just finish my thoughts.
Sorry.
A lot of those investments will be public, but there are a lot of opportunities for private investment in revenue generating infrastructure or projects that are part of improving ROI and operational livability, or just protecting existing capital and assets that are perfectly bankable and that need to be brought and put together in a way that it becomes palatable to investors, at least to certain types of investors. It won't be all of them, right, as Matt explained earlier, but there's going to be different flavors ranging from the most social impact or just bonds that help, going all the way to plain private great revenues, but there is needs for all kind of capital across the array of adaptation. Mm-hmm. And so to your next question, then concrete examples can range from in San Francisco, where I'm based, the San Francisco Bay Area, there was a bond that was passed recently for restoration, and it was passed under labels around restoring wildlife and fishes and all kind of things that speak to people, quality of water. But the main reason this bond was passed is really because restoring wetlands will help prevent floodings in the South Bay, where there's a lot of corporate assets there, very valuable assets. And the corporations were involved in helping pay for the campaign and making this pass. So it starts from sort of plain public finance, but looking at bonds and understanding which ones can help with adaptation and maybe are worth paying closer attention to, going all the way into, there's boutique private equity funds that are being started right now that focus on products and services that are going to grow, that are going to be in greater demand in a world where we need to adapt. And that can range from construction to analytics to water efficient technology to wildfire retardant soap. And there's been studies, the Japanese government has published extensive studies of hundreds of companies in Japan showing how their products were bound to grow because of increased demand, because of the impacts of climate change. And so it really runs the gamut in terms of type of investments and returns that can come with it.
It strikes me as rather similar to when people in healthcare discuss the difference between prevention and treatment. And everyone always says, we need to move more towards prevention. Prevention gives you far better returns and far greater quality of life and so on. And, somehow they don't actually direct money towards prevention. We still end up spending more on cancer than we do on lifestyle advice.
Right, and right now we're more in a situation where the smoker comes out of the hospital after having their lung removed and lights a cigarette, right? And we rebuild in the same place, in the same way, in floodplains, in areas that are bound to be subject to extreme weather events without really necessarily thinking really well about how do we shift development patterns so that we take those things into account. And FEMA is paying for rebuilding the same way in the same place. So the prevention isn't happening. There are numbers, including numbers published by the EIU, that show that the benefits of investing in prevention, of course, are 4 to 60-fold those of coming in after the fact. But in hindsight, it's always 20/20, and right now there's a lot of competing priorities. And how do you know that this $1 is going to be the right one to save you this?
So the two things that can make a difference on the healthcare one, to run with this analogy, one is governments, with public health campaigns, or things like smoking bans. I mean, a smoking ban would be analogous, I guess, to you're not allowed to build in this place; it's just too low. And then the other one is insurance companies have got really rather smart at thinking of incentives. Wear your Fitbit and you get a lower insurance premium. What would be the two analogies there?
Well, so insurance is one of the big topics in adaptation, and there is a little bit of an uncomfortable disconnect going on here where a lot of folks, when you ask them about risk, will say, well, it's okay because I'm insured, my investments are insured, the project, but when you ask insurance companies, they say, well, I'm okay because I'll pull out from that market when it becomes uninsurable. So when you put those two conversations together, something's going to give, right?
And each side astonished that the other side didn't understand.
Well, the side that says I'm good because I'm insured is really starting to worry about at what point do we get to a world that's uninsurable, and when does that specifically hit the real estate market where I'm invested, or the specific project or asset that I'm thinking about.
And is there really a growing awareness of that, or are we just starting to see that?
So there is a growing awareness, and I will say the first way to invest in adaptation is not to look for fancy vehicles specialized in adaptation or resilience, but first is to make sure that whatever you invest in as an investor, as an impact investor, is resilient, that it has been thought through and planned to prepare for the future, because investing in poverty reduction programs or renewable infrastructure that are going to be underwater or that are going to be torn apart by changes in weather patterns is not good use of anybody's money, and that's not going to get you the goals that you're seeking. So the first thing is really to understand the risk for any kind of investment and make sure that those are up to where they need to be.
And so which places are on the government side? I mean, I presume the Netherlands has been thinking this sort of way for a long time. Are they?
They're way ahead of it.
Yeah, are they the gold standard?
They're not just the gold standard, they're very activist in the global space,
right,
and making adaptation a topic and showing that it can be done. There are other countries, but what's interesting is that we are seeing the large financial institutions of the kind that were represented on this panel that are in this room, where, and you know who you are, right? But the folks who are really starting to think about how they can integrate those considerations of physical risk, understanding the risk, building resilience, and creating vehicles and investment strategies and portfolios that are going to speak to this topic specifically.
I presume it undermines the whole basis on which insurance and reinsurance are based, that risks aren't, the huge risks aren't correlated. So if you have a volcano in one place, it doesn't mean you have a volcano in another place. If you have, a flood one place, you don't have a flood another place. But actually, climate change means these things come together.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And the insurance companies, I presume, know this.
So, of course they do. It's a bit of a different conversation. In Europe, insurance companies are much more open to having these discussions. They're doing modeling, they're looking at their liabilities, they're looking at their investments, they're working with reinsurers. Reinsurers have done a lot of modeling on these issues. In the US, it's still an uncomfortable topic for a lot of insurance companies. And it's also one where their hands are tied in many ways, because they can only set premiums 1 year out using historical data, and those two things defeat any attempt to take into account climate change.
Right.
And you will need to wait to have enough historical data on climate for them to be able to account for climate, which is sort of thinking on his head.
So one thing that I do think is on your side in this discussion, in comparison with people talking about, divestment or whatever, is the fiduciary duty actually plays to you rather than against you, because the first duty is don't lose the people's all their money because you built on a floodplain.
That's true in two different ways. First, it's a risk conversation.
Yeah.
It's not an ESG or impact conversation.
Yeah, and then you don't need to talk about returns. You're just talking about this is a big risk.
You're talking about volatility and protecting
Yeah.
your assets. But it's also an impact conversation, because one answer is to say, well, then I'll pull out my money from this place or this type of investments that are going to become more risky. Well, in reality, to build resilience, you really need to go the other way. And it's shareholder engagement, and it's providing funds for corporations and cities that are most exposed to build up their defense and become more resilient. And because this is a new topic right now, the very fact of bringing this question as part of shareholder engagement, of the questionnaires that may go around, already helps spur conversations internally. And we hear that from corporations who say, oh yeah, my investors are asking about this, I need to start looking into this. So even if they didn't have the drive internally, maybe there was reluctance around climate change, they're starting to do this work because they realize that they need to for their own risk management and for their investors.
Mm-hmm. I think I have time for one question. To me, this is a new topic and fantastically interesting, so I hogged a lot of it, sorry. But we have, if anyone has a question? Yes, I have one down here at the back. If somebody could bring a mic. Just keep your hand up so they can see where they're going. Yep, thank you.
I'm Michael Raunhorst with SEMA Funds. Could you please just reiterate your last point? I think you said that if you're a fiduciary, you may need to become in shareholder engagement in order to help the companies make a shift towards the new realities of climate change.
Yeah, and I can build on that a little bit. When we talk about risk around transition risk, and there's the conversation around divestment, obviously. When we're talking about the physical impacts of climate change, I'm actually advocating pretty hard against divestment, because that would be very counterproductive for society as a whole and for the economic system as a whole. And so the way to build resilience is first through shareholder engagement and having those conversations with your portfolio companies or the project, so that to make sure that they have done their homework, that they are preparing for this risk, or to give them an incentive to do so. And there's also going to be opportunities that don't exist right now, but let's revisit here in a few years what funds and vehicles there might be to support adaptation and resilience investments in corporations, in infrastructure projects that help them maintain or improve their profitability and their sustainability over the long run.